Hello, readers. How are you? So I feel like it's been a while since I've done this, but I just want to say thank you and welcome back to everyone else who has visited my channel before, and very new welcomes to those of you who haven't. My name is Kim with Native Lady Book Warrior, and today I will be reviewing Killers of a Flower Moon by David Grann. So let's get started. So, yay! I feel like it's been a while since I've posted a book review, but I am very glad you all are joining me here today, and I hope you all are doing very, very well. And also, I'm going to announce right now that this book review can be triggering, for I will be discussing actual events of death, violence, overt racism, systemic oppression, and discrimination and murder against Indigenous peoples, and more specifically against the citizens of the Osage Nation. Killers of the Flower Moon is a historical nonfiction book written by David Grann, who is an American journalist, staff writer for the New York Magazine. And this book is extensively researched, pulling sources from FBI files to congressional records, court transcripts, grand jury testimony, Osage Tribal Council records, oral histories, field reports from the BIA or Bureau of Indian Affairs, even wills and last testimonies, and finally interviews with relatives of the Osage victims, and much, much more. I very much commend David Grann for his amazing detective work and digging out the details and the very much needed truth for this book. This book is split into three parts, or what he calls in the book three chronicles. And it immediately starts with the introduction of Molly Burkhart. Molly Burkhart is a wealthy Osage woman in the book's first chronicle is titled as The Marked Woman. And in the very beginning of that chronicle, Molly immediately notices that her sister Anna is missing. And Molly's fear and concern is very much interwoven into a lot of that. And her sister's disappearance is especially fearful for Molly because of the very, very recent high frequency in the number of Osage deaths in their area, which is Osage County. And unfortunately, right away, in that very, very first chapter, not only is her sister, or Anna, is she found dead, but she has definitely been murdered. Then this book transitions with much detail on the investigation of Molly's sister. And he does a very good job at painting also the historical narrative that's the foundation of the Osage's journey to wealth. That part is very, very essential in the beginning of this story, starting with the forced removal of the Osage from their Aboriginal lands because of the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act, or the Allotment Act, was legislation passed by Congress in 1887, where Congress basically subdivided tribal communal lands into assigned allotments to each Osage, or even across the board to native tribal members or head of households. Not only did this act diminish tribal lands, but it was also very much an assimilative policy that broke up tribal social units, encouraging nuclear families, the ownership of lands, that whole idea, that Western ideal of owning land, and opening the remaining of the lands that weren't divided up by allotment. It was open to colonial settler ownership. But during this time, Chief James Burkhart of the Osage Nation and John Palmer, who actually was adopted by the Osage Nation, and he later on would marry an Osage woman, they both heavily negotiated with the federal government over the terms of the Osage Nation's allotment terms. And they successfully were able to increase allotments from 167 acres all the way to 650 acres per individual land allotment. The Osage were also able to include provision that stated the oil, gas, coal, and I believe other minerals in their lands were reserved for the Osage tribe. And because the Osage knew that there were oil deposits underneath their reservation. So I'm going to read a passage in the book, and I promise it's not spoilery, but it's merely helpful in the foundation, the historical foundation and narrative in this book. So, like others on the Osage tribal roll, Molly and her family members each received a head right, essentially a share in the tribe's mineral trust. When the following year Oklahoma entered into the Union as the 46th state, members of the tribe were able to sell their surface land in what was now the Osage County. But to keep the mineral trust under tribal control, no one could buy or sell head rights. These could only be inherited. Molly and her family had become part of the first underground reservation. So there's a whole chapter in this book that talks about the establishment, or just it's labeled as the underground reservation, and that's basically the mineral and oil resources underneath Osage lands. Therefore, Osage families like Molly, they could lease their lands and in addition collect the royalties, or in this case oil royalties, and there would even be bidding wars that were bidded on by rich oil barons for these Osage land leases. And also this led to the Osage Nation becoming the richest people per capita in the entire world at that time. And soon the Osage people, including the family of Molly Burkhart, would become victims of systemic oppression, corruption, and even murder, and what is now historically known as the Osage Reign of Terror. So the next section in this book is called The Evidence Man. And this part of the story begins with the involvement of the Bureau of Investigation. I mean, obviously, which would later become known as the FBI, or Federal Bureau of Investigation. And because, yes, people, later on in the story, things, it's very mysterious, but there's also very much brutal incidences that escalate quickly, violently, and most of the time very gut-wrenchingly, and therefore they had to call it, becomes a federal matter, because if you don't know, jurisdiction in indigenous lands in the United States is very complicated. So because of the Major Crimes Act and all of that. So I'm not going to go into that because I could talk forever on that. And in that section, we unravel treachery and betrayal and scheming politics and monstrous greed, infuriating injustices, and even at times heartbreaking accounts of institutional racism and the effects of those of that institutional racism. This book, man, it was a wow. And I confess at times it was very hard for me to read this book. I had to take breaks, and I actually found myself rereading two other books, like two whole books, to take care of myself, and while I was just reading this one. So this book took me longer than I anticipated to finish, and I found myself so angry and full of wrath at times, or saddened and heartbroken, or simply just very, very, very curious. And I was gobbling up a lot of the historical accounts and events that were taking place to see where the story and where to see where this book was going, and to just find out what was happening. And finally, I feel like I finished the book, very much confirming that the US government completely failed in their trust responsibility in protecting the Osage Nation, and that they systematically oppressed Native nations so much and their governments to the extent where they, the Native nations themselves, couldn't even protect themselves from what was going on. And this also included that huge, crazy jurisdictional complexity that very much still exists to this very day. So, my rating of this book is 4.5 stars. The writing style is very, very detailed in this book, and the details of the investigation are also really, really amazing. I enjoyed how parts of this book almost felt like I was reading like a crime novel, but the details with some of the people in the book were also explored extensively, and the inclusion of the history of the Osage people, especially with their lands, were also a very, very important inclusion, and I appreciated that as well. I commend and I appreciate how much digging Grann had to do to paint this story that included original statements by so many people on so many different levels. But I wish that I got more details on Molly Burkhart herself or her family, and on some of the Osage people and their own accounts on how this ordeal and their experiences and how it impacted them and their community, rather than just kind of generalizing the overall fear and hopelessness that was going on at the time. But also, I wish more was shared on their resilience as a tribe and as families. But other than that, this was quite a good read for me. So that concludes my book review for Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. So thanks everyone. If you have read this book, I've also am going to add a link below for a book discussion that's filled with plenty of book spoilers and my very bookish thoughts, likes, and loves for this book. So until next time, I shall see you all soon, and I hope you guys are all doing very well. I hope you are healthy. Hope your families are doing well. Hope you guys are safe. So have a good day, everyone, and I shall see you again soon. Bye.